The foreclosure notice was folded into the back pocket of my jeans like a secret I couldn't leave at home. It was the size of a postcard and the weight of everything that had gone wrong that year. Rain had already begun to bead on the paper by the time I pulled out of town. The ink smelled faintly of toner and municipal windows. The edges had started to curl where I'd worried them and read them again. I folded it tighter with my palm and drove toward High Point, toward the small cabin that Ara Vance owned and had hired me to patch. High Point was a name meant to flatter a hill. The road up the mountain took the vanity out of it. 2 lanes that didn't bother to be straight, brakes that smoked at the end of a grade, pines that kept whatever secrets a place like that hoarded. The cabin sat with its shoulders hunched against the wind, a porch sagging toward the mud, like someone tired of pretending to be level. Tin roof, a crooked chimney, shutters that didn't line up. From the road I could see the porch boards were dark with rot, one of the corner posts bowed, and a handrail dangled like a failed promise. She met me in the yard with a clipboard and a set of rules that were more like a perimeter. Start tomorrow, stay outside, don't come in before 9, knock if you have to, but don't expect me to open the door. She said it without a smile, and for a long second I couldn't tell whether that was invitation or armor. I told her my name. She told me where the joists were soft and where the ledger had started to pinch away from the sill. I wrote it down because that's how I've always measured things, by the place where wood fails and what it takes to make it whole again. I told her I could be there early and leave late. She nodded and handed me the keys to the side gate, a small private concession, and that was the closest thing to trust she offered the first day. The work was the work. Measure, pry, replace. Sister a joist, pack out rotted material, set new flashing under the ledger. We took the porch up in sections because you can't take everything down at once. The house will fall into itself like a thought, poorly attended. The mornings were cold. My hands smelled of cedar and rust. Nights tasted like coffee and the leftover heat in my truck. On the second morning, I found a cooler tucked behind the pile of old shingles. It wasn't the kind of place people left food for contractors, not without some note, but it was there, shaded by a tarp. Paper-wrapped sandwiches, a thermos of something that might have been tea, a small jar of pickles. No name, no note. The food was the kind people make when they assume you won't be picky and you don't have to be. Solid sandwiches with too much bread-to-meat ratio, salt enough to wake you up. I ate the sandwich on the last sagging step of the porch and waited until the sound of the truck faded before I listened for the piano. It was a small sound at first. One wrong note, then a cluster of uncertain chords through a wall. I didn't go to the door. I sat and listened until I could hear the room with the piano in it. The way Ara pushed a key and the note hung like a question. Days folded on themselves. I mapped the damage in ledger lines and in coffee stains. Ara left me space and watched from inside, through slatted blinds. She'd show up sometimes at noon with a thermos and sit on the top step while I ate what she had left. We made small bargains. I didn't ask about the scars along her forearms. She didn't volunteer their origin. When she did talk, it was in pieces, and only when the porch felt like something other than a courtroom. We had rules the same way the house did. Don't pry into what a person hasn't offered. Don't touch if you haven't been allowed. Don't assume your help is a kindness. I respected them because that was how I knew to keep working without breaking anything that wasn't mine to fix. The piano was a confession. At night, when the house exhaled and the wind made the tin roof talk like old neighbors whispering, she'd practice. Wrong notes like raw edges at first, an unfinished sentence. Then a second note, then a pause that meant she was listening to the first one and thinking about the second. I started to understand the music the way I could understand a joist's complaint. It told me where something had once broken and how it had learned to hold itself together. One evening, after we'd tightened a new ledger and sealed the worst of the leaks, she sat on the top step and handed me a sandwich. The cooler had been there again in the morning, the thermos refilled. We ate in the damp air, and each of us rearranged our words until something fit. "Do you play?" I asked, because the piano made her neighborhood inside the house, and I wanted to know if she knew how to finish a sentence. "Enough," she said. Will you—" She hesitated, searching for the right practical phrasing. "Stay while I try something? Not stare if you can, just be there." I said yes, because it was the kind of thing I could do. She unlocked the door and let me in for the first time. The room smelled of dry polish and lemon oil. The piano wasn't new. It carried a history in the way the ivory had worn, and the bench had a dent from where someone had once leaned too hard. She sat, placed her hands on the keys, and played a cluster of notes that were more like fingerprints than music. "May I?" I asked after a moment. "May I put my hands over yours, just to guide the fingers, the way I'd steady a board until someone nails it?" She looked at me, then at her hands, and then back into my eyes. "Yes," she said, "but don't fix what I haven't broken." I placed my hands over hers, warm on cool skin. The first touch was all permission. Her fingers twitched like birds. I guided one chord slowly. There was an awkwardness to it, the way a carpenter learns to trust another set of hands over his own. We traded positions. She guided me, I guided her. The wrong notes became an honest attempt at a chord that sounded like an agreement. Later, when the porch felt safe enough for something that wasn't repair work, she asked, "Do you sleep in a bed or in the truck?" "Depends on the week," I said. "Truck has the heat going. Bed has my father snoring like a broken furnace." She laughed then. It was small, the kind of sound that was private because the mountain held onto it. When I leaned in to kiss her, I did the only practical things I knew how to do. I asked if that was all right. She put her hand against my chest and said yes. It was a first kiss that kept its handrails, deliberate, careful, both of us watching for the moment one of us might step away. It didn't save anything, and it didn't need to. It was a choice that cost something, vulnerability, an old pride, and it cost in the way all honest choices do. Things in a small town find their way into the mouth of someone who enjoys telling stories. Silas Vance liked telling stories for what they could do. He had stores and cables into municipal boards, a handshake that felt like a contract, and teeth that felt like closing arguments. I saw him at the lumberyard, his jacket still smelling faintly of money. He smirked at me the way people smirk at something they've decided to own. "Still fixing old heartbreaks?" he asked, loud enough for men to hear. "Or selling your head for sandwiches?" I said nothing. Benji, who works with me when I need an extra set of shoulders or a joke, clenched his jaw and told me later that Vance liked to test men to see if they'd bite. I bit nothing, but I felt each insult like a nail in my pockets. The foreclosure notice became heavier. Word got around the mountain as words do. People start filling blanks with their mouths. They asked if Ara was the sort who took pity on men. They asked why I'd come. The town liked to set its clock by other people's mistakes. One morning the gate to the cabin was locked. My key turned only in my hand and stopped at the stop. The padlock looked ordinary. The message it sent felt larger. I paced the yard with my palm on the damp post until a neighbor drove by and told me that Silas had been in, had asked for the property tax record, had been through the papers on Ara's desk. He'd said things about vultures and about the kindness of the wealthy. He'd suggested that maybe it wasn't safe for her to have regular visitors. When Ara opened the door, she didn't smile. Her eyes were a small cliff. "I couldn't risk it today," she said. "The town likes a story. I don't want to be one." The lockout was the worst kind of humiliation because it was quiet. There was nothing dramatic to film, no rowdy shouting on the porch, just my body kept on the outside and people inside a story I hadn't written. I wanted to pound and ask and explain. Instead, I drove down the mountain until I could find Benji and the lumberyard and the smell of sawdust and men's hands. We talked in the parking lot, and then I went home and read the foreclosure notice again like a litany. You have a choice in that moment. Pride tells you to let it have you, to let your name mean more than your need. Survival tells you to take the offered hand, even if it has prices you don't like. Some choices hurt either way. The mountain tells you it will decide for you. It does not wait on your dilemmas. The storm came in the night when the town's gossip was loudest. Rain that wanted to slip inside the house like a memory, wind that honked through the pines like an accusation. I had convinced myself to stay away because of the lock, then the lights went out. I drove back with the truck lights cutting through a band of rain. The road was a river that the high beams made into something personal. At the turnoff, I saw a small car pulled to the ditch, its hood up. I stopped. A figure was climbing toward a neighbor's porch, and when he turned I knew it wasn't one of the usual town watchers. It was a man with a suit that made mud look expensive. Silas Vance. He waved me off like a fly, but I kept going. I had an old rule about roofs and storms. If the rain is coming in and someone is in, you don't debate their right to be there. You get them under cover. The front door was battered from the wind. Inside the house, the piano bench had been knocked into a corner. An upright lamp lay on its side like evidence of an interrupted thought. Ara was wrapped in a blanket on the sofa. She looked smaller in the storm. When I knelt to help her up, she pulled away at first, and then let my hands close around her shoulders. "Did you call someone?" I asked. "No," she said. "I thought I could ride it out." The roof held until it didn't. A sheet of plaster had come down in the stairwell. A nail stuck out at a bad angle. I reached to move the board and cut my hand on the exposed metal. It wasn't dramatic. Quick pain, a steady stream of red, the cold of the night mixing with the rust on the nail. Ara hissed at the blood, then without thought took my wrist and pressed the back of her hand into the cut, her thumb on the wound. She spoke softly, gave explicit permission for me to let her do it. Not because I wasn't grateful, but because somewhere between us lines had been drawn carefully, and she wanted them respected, even in a crisis. She tore the hem of her shirt and pressed the cloth to the cut. "Hold still," she said. The house was loud with the storm and quiet with the fact of us. When I pulled my jacket around both of us, the foreclosure notice fell from the inner pocket, where I'd placed it for safekeeping, and soaked into the blanket on the floor. The ink blurred into a small bloom like a bruise. I picked it up and held the paper between my fingers, as if that could stop the water. Later, when the rain eased and the town's lights were a fogged halo below, she sat across from me at the kitchen table with a stack of papers. She'd changed into dry clothes, and the scratches on her arms caught in the porch light and looked like a map I didn't know how to read. "I've been watching you work this week," she said. "I didn't know much at first. I thought you were just another man with a hammer and a story. Then I saw the way you measured and said no when something wasn't right. You have standards." I wanted to tell her the foreclosure was mine. I wanted to hand her the town's letter and ask her to read it and tell me whether pride or payment was the worst teacher. I didn't. Instead, I said, "I need to keep the crew and the shop. My father—" I stopped, because saying father with the rest of it made the sound of it like a closed workshop door. She listened, the way she had when I held my hand over her fingers at the piano. Then she reached for a pen and pushed a legal pad toward me. "What if I invested?" she asked. "Not charity, investment, terms, promissory note, escrow, a written agreement. My lawyer would draft it, you would have your lawyer. I would require a small % of the business until the note is repaid. Oversight, not control. Transparent books." She spoke like a contractor quoting materials lists. No melodrama, no saving line. She laid out percentages and repayment schedules, a security interest in equipment rather than property if possible, and a right to audit the books quarterly. She told me she would not hold the house itself as collateral. She insisted on clarity because that was how she protected herself. I sat in the chair feeling old and young at the same time. The choice was simple and brutal: accept and give some independence away, or refuse and possibly lose everything. Both options hurt in different ways. Pride would keep you free of the strings, but it wouldn't buy you bolts and nails. Acceptance would buy you breathing room and a new set of obligations. "Why?" I asked finally. "Not why are you doing this, but why me? Why now?" She put a hand to the piano's dented lid as if to steady it. "I know what it takes to keep a place standing," she said. "Sometimes that means helping someone fasten their roof. Sometimes it means signing a paper. There are costs to helping, and there's a cost to not helping. I'm willing to bear the first if you're willing to do the work that comes after." We wrote a draft that night, not a romantic document, but a ledger of promises. She insisted on an independent attorney for me. She signed in front of a neighbor and a notary. The terms were not humiliating. She asked for a minority interest and a fixed repayment schedule, but they were not without cost. The choice was clear. It hurt either way. Then Vance found reason to pick a fight. He accused her of undue influence, of coaxing a desperate man into a bad bargain. It was the town's favorite story, the woman of means preying on a man who hadn't the sense to fend for himself. He put up a challenge in the local paper and then escalated to the courthouse. The hearing was a small room, with chairs that remembered different arguments. Vance's lawyer liked the sound of his own voice and asked his questions like a man pulling wires from an attic. His line was neat. Did she have capacity? Was the man unduly influenced? Did she seek to profit off a desperate worker? I sat with my hands folded because that's the only thing I could do that wasn't a tool. Ara's counsel was short and precise. She had her own testimony ready, a copy of the correspondence, a record of the meeting with independent legal counsel. She wore the same practical coat from which her sleeves were rolled, and her scars were visible where her hands lay on the table. They were not hidden, and they didn't earn pity. The lawyer asked the kind of questions that sound like they are meant to make a person crack. Did she know the man? Did she realize he had debts? Had she pressured him? Ara answered in sentences that were measured, like a man calling the line for a joist. "I know the work he does," she said. "I watched him through the week and negotiated with him. I proposed terms to help preserve his business because I want suppliers who are competent and honest. I sought counsel to make sure the contract was fair. I offered him the option to walk away. He consulted counsel and accepted. That is the extent of my involvement." The judge listened. He looked at the wet copy of the foreclosure notice I had left on the bench when I'd come in. I'd meant to bring it as context, but it was embarrassing to lay my failures on display. He asked a few clear questions about whether the man had been given time to consider the deal. I'd said that I'd had the sense to get a lawyer because it was my last stitch before everything came undone. The judge could see that the forms were proper, the signatures in order, and the independent counsel present. Vance's accusation relied on insinuation. He painted pictures of a woman using her money like a hook, but the facts were the ones that holed up in small rooms full of echoed footsteps. There was a signed agreement. Legal counsel had been present. Witnesses had signed. Ara had not rushed me. She had insisted I understand the terms. She'd threatened nothing. Her scars were not evidence of weakness. They were signs of survival, and they didn't absolve anyone of responsibility. The judge dismissed the complaint for lack of merit. He said the elements of undue influence were not met. Vance's face, when he understood he'd lost that day, gathered all the small cruelties of life into a look that would have been a caricature if it weren't so real. We left the courthouse tired. The town filed its opinions, and some people took Vance's side, while others changed theirs. The worst of the whispers fell flat in the presence of paperwork. After the hearing, the deal was what it had always been, a careful, terrible exchange. I had money to pay the note and keep the crew. I sold a piece of independence on terms that would let me buy it back. There were strings. I had to report quarterly. I had to accept oversight. Ara had to accept that her name would be turned into gossip like a stone dragged through mud. We fixed the porch and replaced the bollards and put a proper flashing along that tricky edge where the roof met the wall. I taught Benji to splice a subfloor and measured joists until I could picture them with my eyes closed. Ara sat at the piano, the windows open, and played as if the wind itself couldn't disrupt the melody. There were consequences. I learned to pay attention to what it meant to have someone looking through your books. I had to argue with myself about the length of the repairs I wished to take, the timesheets I might pad, or the invoices I might bite. Each small temptation felt like a debt already. Pride flared and then settled. The company carried on with fewer nights of cold and more bills paid on time. My father came by the shop one evening, and when I told him what I'd done, nodded like a man who'd seen a roof survive a winter. There was gratitude, yes, and relief, and a bruise to the ego. Ara's scars never stopped being part of her story. People asked. I learned to deflect. She used public appearances to talk about the work she'd done to keep her life measured rather than dramatic. In quiet moments, she told me about the piano lessons and the way music taught her to accept wrong notes as part of a phrase, rather than as sin. "You can fix the broken thing," she said once, "or you can learn to play around the missing part." We learned to choose together. Not always the same thing, never without an argument. I wanted to repair and move on. She wanted assurance that repair was steady and honest. Sometimes that meant a conversation about numbers. Sometimes it meant a sandwich left on the stoop and the space to rest. The house breathing was a small miracle of routine. The piano's wrong notes existed and then didn't when fingers had practiced them into a thing of tolerable sound. The porch had new boards that held straight under weight. The foreclosure notice hung on the fridge like a relic, stained, wrinkled, a reminder of a night the mountain had nearly decided for me. I kept it there because paper remembers what people try to forget. When people ask what was the price, I tell them the same thing I tell myself when I find a warped board and decide whether to replace it or sand it down. Both options cost. Pride costs in loss. Acceptance costs in concessions. Some choices hurt either way. We chose anyway because not choosing was its own pain, the slow dissolving that comes when the mortgage company sends another envelope and the floor sags a little more. There were nights I still read the foreclosure notice, hands on the paper, thinking of a different life I might have had. There were nights Ara leaned her head on my shoulder while the piano played wrong notes into something like consolation. She would trace a scar on her forearm, and I would, as gently as a man can, put my hand on the knuckle of her thumb and say nothing. The silence became a kind of prayer between us, not for rescue but for stamina. The town didn't stop talking because people never do. Vance moved on to other contests. He still wore the same expensive jacket to town meetings, but people who had seen the papers and the hearing and, more quietly, the work done on the porch began to murmur differently. They began to trust the sound of a floor that no longer bowed in the middle. We kept repairing. When a storm ripped shingles from the roof a year later, we worked together and fixed them before the week was done. She would hand me a hammer and then, for no performative reason, go to the piano and play until her hands stopped claiming what had been hard. The house no longer held its breath the way it had when I first arrived. Its windows breathed. The piano now hit a chord that included the wrong notes and the right ones both, and it sounded like something that had survived being learned. On the porch one evening, when the light came down in a way that made the boards glow, I took the foreclosure notice off the fridge. It had faded. Rain had made the ink halo. I folded it and slid it into my pocket the way I'd carried it the first day. It felt less like a brand and more like a ledger entry. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, watching the road. "Sometimes," I said. "The cost is always there. But regret would mean I didn't do the work after. We both had to keep a place standing." She smiled in that slight way she had when she wasn't playing a note. "We chose," she said. "That is the important part. Choices hurt. They don't have to be the end of the story." They don't. They carve rooms out of life. They make the house into a home, or they leave it boarded. They give you something to put your hands to and teach you how to hold on without strangling. If this story has landed somewhere for you, if the trade-offs and small repairs feel familiar, stay with it a little longer. There's a weight to choosing, but there is also a work to be done afterward. If this tale moved you, consider subscribing for more small, careful stories. Tell me in the comments, which choice would you have made when the storm came? Hold your pride or take the hand offered? Some choices hurt either way, but the fixing is where we make a life.